Today we want to talk about money and the payment system, basically what we use to buy things. Some of this is a little bit of history. There's a little bit of analysis that's blended in here, but mainly history. And I think it's kind of interesting for a lot of people. We've been using money for our whole lives, and familiarity with money kind of makes us think we know something about it, and sometimes we learn some new things about something that is so familiar. First of all, a definition. Money is anything that is generally accepted in payment for goods and services. Money is anything that is generally accepted in payment for goods and services. And I'll underline a couple of words here, a couple of terms. The one is anything, and then the other is generally accepted. I underline the word anything, and I mean by that we have a definition of money that is a functional definition of money. Functional in the sense of, can it perform this certain function? Okay? And our definition of money is it's not a coin made of metal. It's not a piece of paper with a picture of a dead white man on it. It's not anything in particular. It could be anything. 300 years ago, tobacco leaves were money in Virginia. And there are certain places where limestone rocks have served as money, and other places where shells have served as money, and some places beads. This whole idea about Manhattan Island back in 1600s being bought from the Indians, the natives of that area, for beads, for wampum. This is something that, that was money in those days. Interestingly enough, the Indians that sold that land didn't own it. But they said, sure, you can buy this. And by the way, I would sell Springfield to any of you who'd like to buy it also. But the whole idea is that anything could potentially serve as money. Now, there are things that are not useful as money, ice cubes and things of that nature, because they melt and then your money's gone. But I'm just saying to you that we don't have a definition of money that it has to be a certain thing. Okay? The real key about money is that it's generally acceptable. If you could take a marker and just go out and get a car wash or buy a pair of shoes with enough of these, or get your hair cut, or buy a house with enough of them, buy a car, things like that, then these things would be money. Okay? Anything that is generally acceptable, generally just go far and wide, roam around, you can buy stuff with it, that makes it money. And so over the years, and I've mentioned a few of these things, the tobacco leaves and the shells and so forth, over the years many different things have served as money. We live a fairly short life, and so for us what money is hasn't changed very much. What money is throughout my life and throughout your life has been essentially two things. One is currency, and I mean by that both the paper currency and the coins, and the other thing is checking account balances. And that is what is generally accepted in payment for goods and services in the United States. Now, what has happened over the years is, and we'll come back and talk about this more later on, is that those checking account balances that have been, that we can buy things with, when I was a kid, the only way to get access to those checking account balances, you could go to the bank and get some cash, but then when you go buy something, you're really paying cash. But the only way really to gain access to your checking account balance when I was growing up, and really at about the time most of you were very young, would be to write a check. And what's happened over the years is we got to the point now where we've got the debit cards. And that, for a while we had cards. They weren't debit cards, they were ATM cards. So you could go to the bank and get cash in the middle of the night or something like that. And then after a while, you've got the same card, or a newly issued card, but gains access to the money in that account. And now you can go to the grocery store, go to a restaurant, or go to a gas station or whatever, and use that card and buy things. And so it's still the money in your bank account that's money, the balance in your bank account that is money, but now we have a new way of gaining access to it. And of course, now what you can do also, because I do it, is you can go online and provide some information from your bank account, a routing number for your bank, and then your account number, and you can pay people online. And then that is still, the funds are coming from your bank account, so when we're counting up how much money is there in the United States, we're still counting that checking account balance, but we have other ways of gaining access to it. And so for us, throughout your life, throughout my life, this money has been essentially two things: currency, including both the paper currency and the coins, currency and checking account balances. And we have a term for that. We call that the M1 money supply. I'll put little horns on that so it's clear it's not an L or not an I. M1 money supply. And the reason they've got an M1 there, and by the way, this is the Federal Reserve's definition, or just the Fed. The reason that we have this 1 here is that there are other definitions. There's an M2, there's an M3, and so forth. And what happens is we go from, I'll write it down here, the currency and checking account balances. When we start talking about M2 and M3, we start adding other assets in that are, they say near money. You can convert them to money easily and quickly. Money in your savings account, for example, but you couldn't take money in a savings account and spend it. You go to the grocery store and walk up to the front and say, I want to buy these groceries, and they say, well, okay, pay us, and you say, well, I have $10,000 in my savings account. They'd say, please get out of line. That's not going to work here. You'd have to go someplace and convert that. And so that would be a near money, not quite spendable. And so that would be part of the M2 money supply. And then there are other assets that are a little bit less spendable, a little bit harder to get to, and so forth, M3 money supply. The money supply that is spendable is the M1 money supply. And it's these things. And by the way, this is almost all of it. And then there are a few $billion of other minor items. Used to be they'd talk about traveler's checks, and that would go in here. I'll put traveler's checks. But there's two issues about that. One is, anymore, traveler's checks are going away, and now what we're getting is these stored value cards where you have a plastic card, and it look very much like a debit card, but you'd go someplace and give them money out of your checking account to buy a plastic card. It's got some value stored on it, $100 or $200 or $500 or whatever, and then you would use that card as you go around buying things. The old traveler's checks was actually something that looked like a check. You signed it when you got it, and then you signed it when you got it at the bank, and then you would sign it again. There would be two signatures on it when you would spend it. And they were for fixed amounts of money, $20, $50, $100, that sort of thing. Anyway, so what we have over here are some things that are of minor importance. There may be, and I'm going to put a question mark there, there may be $10 billion worth of these or something like that. And $10 billion is a lot. I'd like to have, just a decent fraction of $10 billion. I'd feel, set for life. But these numbers that we have in the overall money supply, we're talking about these two things added up in the neighborhood of $1.4 trillion. And so when we start talking about another $10 billion thrown in there, that just gets rounded off to zero. So anyway, most of the time when we say M1 money supply, most economists leave off these minor issues over here to write the traveler's checks and the stored value cards and so forth. We leave those off and just focus on the two big ones, currency and the checking account balances. This is money in the United States today. And what I'm telling you is that the evolution in money during our lifetimes, the evolution has not been to change the components of the money supply, it's been to change how do we gain access to that. And really not so much the currency part, but how do we gain access to the funds in our checking account balances. This is money. Will it ever change? It's hard to say never. I'll tell you what, I don't think any time in the near future there will be a change. It may be that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we come back, and why don't we just make a deal to get back here in 200 years? But it may be that 200 years ago, from now I should say, historians will say, oh look, here's what used to be money and now we have something different. That could be, but I think it won't happen anytime soon because these checking accounts, it's our balances in the checking account, but those checking accounts are at banks. Those banks are for-profit institutions. And so if somebody tried to develop some other form of money, in a sense what there would be is competition in the marketplace. If I came along and said, hey, I got a great idea for money, then the bankers would say, hey, people are going to get rid of our checking accounts to get this other kind of money. That's bad. And so then the bankers would get busy to make their bank accounts more appealing, and they would compete to hold that market share. And so they would do everything they could to prevent these new forms of money from developing. And so I guess what I'm saying to you is those banks are out there, they are huge, trillions of dollars worth of assets. They've got marketing departments and they've got smart people working for them, and so they're not going to give up without a fight. And so it will be a long time, I would think, before we just go, well, you know, the checking account, that was a good idea for a while, but now we got something better. Probably not. If there's something better, those same banks are going to try and offer that as well, right? So anyway, so I doubt if there is any quick change. I would imagine what the change will be is over time, as you know, as time goes by, I would think that we'll have new ways of gaining access to those checking account balances. They do a little bit of it in Japan today, maybe a little bit in Europe, and there may be places in the United States, but you know, where you can touch something on your telephone, get near some kind of like a toll booth or a vending machine or something like that, and a signal goes from your phone to that machine, and basically it says, you can take $10, $2, 20 cents, whatever it is, out of my checking account. I want to pay this fee, or I want to buy that merchandise. But some kind of purchase with your phone. But still, we'd be going back to our checking account and getting the money. And so that would be an innovation that's probably not very far down the road. How many of you have cell phones? Put your hand up if you got a cell phone. Keep them up, I want to see. You know, I don't see one student in here that doesn't have their hand up. So, you know, wouldn't that be convenient, since everybody's got a cell phone, wouldn't that be a convenient thing to put that service in there? And of course, we just don't have a select group of people with cell phones and the rest of the world doesn't have it. People have cell phones everywhere. And so this would be an awfully easy way to gain access to the bank accounts. And the same people, MasterCard and Visa and so forth, that are providing these services with our debit cards, they'll no doubt have some kind of a chip in cell phones at some point in the future. So anyway, a few preliminary comments about money. I want to distinguish between three terms here: money and income and wealth. Now, sometimes people confuse these things, and the reason they confuse them, I believe it's simple, is that each one of these have a dollar amount, at least in the United States, a dollar amount attached to it. And since you see the dollar sign each time, it's easy to just say, oh, those are all the same. But this is not a place where we want to blur the distinctions. We want to make these distinctions fine because we're talking about money and banking in this course. I've already told you what money is. That's a spendable asset. Right? It's the thing that is generally accepted in payment for goods and services. You can spend money. Okay? What's income? Income is what we receive for working, for example. You might receive forms of income also from renting out property if you own it, or it might be that you'd have income from royalties if you own some kind of asset, like if you write a book and you get royalties from that. You could have income if you own some stock and you're getting dividends on that. Okay? So there are various ways to earn income, but that word earn is a key to this, is we're selling services, and that's how we get income. And that is not a spendable asset. What we get paid in most cases, not everybody, but in most cases what we get paid is money, and then we can go out and spend that. But income is a payment to owners of productive resources or factors of production, and so that's different than this asset that we spend. Sometimes people get paid income in kind. not in terms of money, but in terms of services. Part of my compensation working here at the university is health insurance, health care, right? And so I have income, that's my receipt, what I receive for working. I have income, but it's not in the form of money. Some people, of course, get housing, some people get cars. There would be other forms of income compensation for working. Wealth, this is all of your assets minus your debt obligations. So what are all the things you own? Okay, and what do you owe? Now, when I say all assets, I've used that term asset before. Asset is just something you own. I've talked about assets before, spendable assets. So all assets, for example, I could have money in a savings account. I could have some stocks. I could have bonds. I could have gold or silver or land. Those would all be assets, but those things that I just mentioned, the savings accounts and the stocks and the bonds and the land and so forth, those aren't things I can spend. And so those would be things I own, but not things I can spend. Debt, same idea, is it may be that that debt is liquid, that I have to, pay today, but it can be that this is longer term debt. It has nothing to do with the liquidity or the spendable aspect. This money is an asset, so it would fall, of all the assets I own or all the assets you own, one of those assets is money, but money is the one that is spendable, that we can use it today to buy something, not only today, but right now, to buy something. If I want somebody to wash my car, then with money I can get them to do that without, selling stocks and bonds and so forth. So anyway, as I say, all these things, the assets, those are valued in dollars usually. The debt, valued in dollars. My income, I normally would value that in dollars. These all have dollar signs in front of them, but they don't all refer to spendable assets, okay? And so only money is, and so when if you hear somebody say this, how much money do you make? That's perfectly all right for almost any situation in the world, but it's just not perfectly all right for a discussion in a money and banking class because we don't make money. We make or we earn income, right? We receive income for working, and part of it, or maybe all of it's going to be in the form of money, but income is what we get for working. Okay. Let's talk about functions performed by money, and I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. Money's been around for a long time. And so a question that we may want to ask or have answered would be, why do people use money? Why do they do it? And as I say, without studying this stuff, you've all gotten to this point in your lives without studying it in any depth. Without studying this, it's kind of hard to have an answer. We're so familiar with money, we use it, but it's hard to know what life was like without it. And so why do people use money? And the answer is because money does certain things for us. Now, this is not really any mystery here. I'm kind of saying something obvious to you. If I say, why do people use cars? Well, it's because cars do something for us. It provides a service. Why do people, wear coats? Well, because those coats provide a service. Why do people have television sets? For a service that the television sets provide. And so the same thing is true for money. Why do people use money? Because money performs certain functions. Money provides certain services. The one we've already talked about. Money is, and this is over here, money is a medium of exchange. And medium of exchange means money is the asset that people use to purchase things. And that's where I said to you a moment ago, money is anything generally accepted in payment for goods and services. We were talking here about the medium of exchange function performed by money. What do we do before money? Pre-money. Anybody want to say the word? Barter. And there's no law that prevents us from bartering today. Barter refers to exchanging goods and services for other goods and services. I mentioned a while ago that we could take one of these markers and go out and say, hey, you want to wash my car, give me a haircut, whatever, and I'll give you these markers. I've got 10,000 of them out in the car, and so if you'll mow my yard, I'll give you 80 of them. And if you'll cut my hair, I'll give you 6 of them. I don't go for those fancy haircuts. So, but you'd probably already guess that. Anyway, but the point is that I could give people these things and get them to perform services for me or provide things to me. And if I do that, that's barter. That's trading goods for either goods or services. Okay? What's the difference between, or why isn't this money? And the answer is, if I give this to you and say, would you mow my lawn, and I'll give you however many, I said 80, I'll give these, and you say, yeah, I'll do that. We have traded goods for, in this case, a service. If I could take these and go anywhere in society, more or less everywhere, and get people to work for me and to provide me with things, then this would be money. But if I can just work out a few transactions, a few trades with people where they'll accept this, but most everybody won't, then these things would not be called generally accepted, and so they wouldn't be money. It would be a barter transaction. And so really what happened way back in time, something became money. It was at first barter because a few people did it, and it was just a barter transaction. And then other people said, hey, that's a good idea. I'm going to do that too. And then over time, more and more people found it convenient to barter, the same things. And then as more and more people were using the same things in these barter transactions, the thing became generally acceptable. It became money. But they didn't use that term money. We're talking about thousands of years ago. The first forms of money that we've been able to find out about, and something possibly came earlier, but we can't find out about those things because it wasn't written down. The first place that they were able to write was in Sumer, which is now Iraq. And we're talking of a period around, 2000 to 2500 BC. Sumer was this area, and then later Mesopotamia was what it was called, and today, modern times, Iraq. And back in this period of around 2000 to 2500 BC, people started using a few things. It was barter at first, but then more and more people started, conducting transactions with the same things. But they used just a few things: barley and wool and silver. And they started paying for things with those items. And like I say, maybe somebody was using money before this, but we wouldn't know because this is where they started writing things down. And that's history, and everything before that was prehistory, and we just don't know what happened in that previous period. But we don't have evidence. Archaeologists haven't dug up something and said, gosh, I think this was used as money because, it was basically we found it in these situations that look like money transactions and so forth. Archaeologists don't have good examples of that. Anyway, barley, it was grown over there, but it's really for us the equivalent of wheat, something they would make bread and cakes and things like that out of. This area, Sumer, is an area, let me kind of give you a little bit of a map here. Up in Turkey, up in the mountains, there are these two rivers that start close together, and they flow down into, here's the Persian Gulf. I'll say Persian Gulf, PG. And so this area in here, in the southern part of the journey of these two rivers, this would be Sumer. And these are the people who first developed writing, cuneiform, and they are also the people who first developed cities. Now, there were obviously towns, before that, small villages and things like that. Originally, if you go back far enough in time, what happened was people would just wander around in small bands and tribes. They were the hunter-gatherers and so forth. And then they started moving into villages and in a little bit bigger towns. But this was the area where we had the first cities with actually thousands of people. And some of those cities were very large, not the first ones. And so this is where they developed a lot of the things that nowadays, when you study like ancient history and so forth, they developed writing there. I'm getting ready to tell you that they developed a crude form of money. They invented like the wheel. They had chariots and things of that nature. A lot of things developed in this area. Okay. There was an agricultural revolution there where they were going out in farming areas. They were raising animals in, pens and so forth. They had livestock. This was really an area, I think some forms of astronomy, this was an area where lots of things happened. And so, anyway, the reason I tell you about these rivers, anybody know the rivers? Go ahead. Tigris and Euphrates, which is which? You got a 50% chance of getting it right. The Euphrates was over on the west, and the Tigris is over on the east. And they were different, in terms of what they were like. The Euphrates was really the river that was most conducive to travel. It was a wider river and a slower moving current, and also lower banks. The Tigris was fast-moving, steep banks and so forth, and so it was a source of water, but it wasn't so much, useful for their economy the way the Euphrates was. In any case, what happened over time is these people would start developing irrigation channels out here and irrigating wider and wider areas. And what happens over time, and we're not talking about over time like over a year or two, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years go by, and all this water that came down there, and it was used, and it would be used to irrigate this area out in what would otherwise be desert, then it would evaporate, and then there's more, and then it would evaporate and so forth. And there was a salt that built up in the soil from that water, and those salts made it really inhospitable to growing wheat. But barley can survive or really thrive in that sort of salty soil, and so what people used over there was barley. But what I'm saying to you, how about wool? Well, they had sheep, and they would send those sheep out into the fields, grass fields, barley fields, and so forth, and the sheep would graze out in this area. And the rivers were, of course, and they're a mile or two wide, but then there would be several miles on either side of each river that would be irrigated, and so there would be grasses and barley and things like that growing. And so there was a large area for people to graze their sheep and so forth, and then they would obviously cut the wool off the sheep and use that to make clothing and other textiles. So anyway, when I say to you that these things were used as money, these things were useful things. Everybody needed to eat. Everybody needed some clothes and blankets and things of that nature. And so there was this widespread use for these things. And so if you said something like, I'm going to go out in society and start trading just some common object with people, some people would trade with you, but most people say, I don't really have a need for that. Yeah, I'm not too interested in that. But what happened was, if you go out and say, hey, would you accept barley for a piece of furniture, or for a cow, or for this, or for that, people would be much more likely to say yes, because they needed to eat. And not only did they need to eat, but people in the cities needed to eat. And those people in cities don't grow a lot of food, and you know what that's like living in a city here. We're not growing a lot of food. There might be a few, tomato plants out on the back porch or something like that, but not enough to sustain you throughout the year. And so we've got a lot of people in cities, and so if somebody came along and said, hey, would you accept some barley in exchange for working, or for some furniture, or for a chariot, or something of that nature, what you might be thinking is, there's a decent chance I'll eat that barley and need that to sustain life. But even if I don't, I know there are a lot of people in the cities that do want it. I know that I'm not just going to get stuck with some barley that has no use. But if somebody tried to trade something else with you, You might say, gosh, I don't want that because, if somebody came along and said, hey, I'd like to buy that cow, or I'd like to, hire you to work for me or whatever, and what I'll give you is a chair, you might say, gosh, I don't really need that chair. It's going to cost me a lot to carry that chair into town. I don't know if anybody in town wants that chair. I don't think so. And so these have a lot of utilitarian purposes and also a very good chance that you can trade it. Wool, same sort of thing. If somebody came along and said, hey, I'd like to buy something from you, I'll give you wool, then you as an individual may not be weaving that wool into textiles, but there's somebody in your household that probably is. They couldn't go to the Walmart or something like that to buy clothing. And so there's somebody in each household. These would be extended families of maybe 15, 30 people living in the household. There's somebody that is weaving fabrics. And so you say, yeah, I would accept a little wool. There's a good chance we'll use it. And if we don't, there's somebody in town that's going to need it. And so then the other thing, silver was money. Part of the reason that was money, of course it's pretty and so forth. Part of the reason that was money, though, was that people during those days did have bracelets and they had necklaces and things of that nature. And so there was a desire for some ornamentation and some beauty and so forth. And so silver was desirable. And these are the things, but silver, by the way, was pretty valuable. You've got to recognize that these people living 4,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago, were, by today's standards, very poor. And so if you came along and said, hey, I want to buy something from you and I'll give you an ounce of silver, that would be a lot. I mean, that might be a month's wages or something of that nature. And so this is not something that would be changing hands all the time. The barley and the wool would be something that on a common basis, just any old time, people would accept that. So there was, at first, barter. And then certain things became more and more used in barter, and those things emerged as the first forms of money. I don't mean to say they were money in the form of currency, coins or paper money. I mean they were generally accepted in payment for goods and services, just as I mentioned to you back in Virginia 300 years ago, tobacco leaves were generally accepted in payment for goods and services. But this was the first money in history. I don't know if something came before, but as long as we can go back and look at history on these cuneiform documents and so forth, this is where we see some transactions, or this is what we see people using to pay for things over and over again. Questions about this? Suppose that we want to stick with barter. I want you to think just for a moment about the inconvenience of that, because I'm going to use a term here in a moment. Suppose, here I am as an economist. Suppose I wake up in the morning and I say, gosh, I sure am hungry. I'd like to have a little breakfast. And there's no money. So I say, I guess what I'm going to do is get out and do a little trading and eat some breakfast. So I go to my next door neighbor's house and knock on the door and I say, hey, how you doing? They say, fine. What can I do for you? I say, I'm really hungry and I was wondering if I could trade a little economics for some, bacon and eggs. And they probably just, because they're neighbors, invite me in and give me some bacon and eggs and send me on my way. But that's charity. But if they are just going to treat me in an arm's length transaction, it's a economics. I don't have a big need for that today. No. And so I say, okay, and I go to the next door, and I knock on the door. Hey, let me introduce myself. I'm, whoever I am. I'm Tom. I'm your neighbor. I live down the street, and I'd like a little bacon and eggs for breakfast, a little bit of toast, something like that. Then they go, well, what are you going to give me? And I say, how about some economics? I could, while you're fixing the bacon and eggs, I could tell you about the stock market, and I could tell you about inflation and things like that. And they'd say, no, that would kind of make for a bad day, and so no. And then I go on down the road, and I knock, and I ask the question, and knock, and ask the question, on down the road. Before long, it's going to be lunchtime, and I haven't had breakfast yet. So what happened in this barter situation is people spent an inordinate amount of time. It's very inconvenient, but in an economic sense, we don't really measure inconvenience. They spent a lot of resources trying to find a trading partner. What you have to have in this barter situation, to have a trade, I'll put requires and we'll put the quotes around this, double coincidence of wants. That's a requirement for barter. There has to be this double coincidence of wants. And what I mean by that is this. I have to find somebody, and our wants have to match up. I have to have what they want, and they have to have what I want. And there are people in the world who want economics. I can see a number of them sitting here. There are a number of people in the world who want economics. And there are a number of people in the world who have bacon and eggs. But that does not guarantee me breakfast. It's possible that there is nobody in Springfield with bacon and eggs who wants economics. Now, it's possible there are thousands of people in Springfield who have, or who want economics, and it's possible there are thousands of people in Springfield who have bacon and eggs, but those don't have to be the same groups. And unless I can find somebody, unless we find a situation where we can match up these wants, there's no trade. So what we have is a lot of traveling around, meeting people, discussing things, and so forth. And so what economists would say is that this imposes high transaction costs. And let me say this in a slightly different way. What I mean is this, is that there's a cost of breakfast, the bacon and eggs that I want. The cost is what I'm going to have to give up to get it. If it were money, if it's some of my time, that's the cost of the bacon and eggs. There's a cost of carrying out this transaction. In addition to what I have to pay that person, though, I have to find them. I have to negotiate with them. If I come to your door and say, hey, I'll trade, you give me bacon and eggs, I'll give you breakfast, or give you an economics lecture, and you say, okay, we got a deal. What you don't know, and what you don't receive, is you don't know how many hours that I've spent looking for you. And so it's all this other searching time and the negotiations that I go through and so forth. These are costs to me where that you don't actually get anything. So it's a cost of just working out the transaction. And these transaction costs eat up our time. If I spend half the day trying to find somebody to do business with, then that's half the day that I can't go to work and produce anything else, that is potentially there's a demand for. And so if we go back in those societies and the barter days, and people are spending so much time looking for trading partners, they were not spending time working. And so their society was poor because so many of their resources were burned up in just trying to find a trading partner. Transaction costs. We have transactions costs today, but what happens is over time we try to find ways to reduce those. And that's really what money did for us, is money made it where I could take with me, go to the neighbor and take some barley or take some wool or take some silver and say, hey, I'd like to have breakfast. I got some barley or I got some wool or I got some silver. And they say, come on in, neighbor, have a seat. And I give that to them, I eat breakfast, and then I go about my business, and the rest of the day I'm working. And so what money did is it got rid of this double coincidence of wants requirement, and it reduced these transactions costs, and it allowed for us to have a more prosperous society. Let's go on and talk about, and we'll come back to transactions costs, let's talk about the second function performed by money, the second reason that people use money. Money serves as a unit of account. And money provides a common measure of value in our society, in our marketplace. Let's go back again to the barter situation. Let's say all there are is just goods and services out there, and there's no such thing as money. Now we start talking about, and this is a little bit like visiting a foreign country where you're familiar with the dollar, and all of a sudden they're using pesos or whatever the currency is in another country. And that can be confusing, but that's what we're talking about here, is every place you go, there's no way of saying what the value of something is in any familiar terms. Everything's just valued in terms of other things. And so if we had three goods, X and Y and Z, then we wouldn't say this is $2, $3, $4. What we'd say is, well, the value of X, we can express that in terms of units of Y, or the value of X, we could express it in terms of units of Z. And the same thing, good Y, we could express that. We've already said Y in terms of X and X in terms of Y, but Y in terms of Z. And so, and that's really all the combinations of these three different goods. But each good would be valued in terms of the other goods. And you might think, that's not so bad. You know, three goods, three different ways of stating values. And by the way, this is all the combinations. You don't have to value X in terms of itself or Y in terms of itself and so forth. It's goods in terms of each other. So here's X in terms of good Y, or Y in terms of good X. That's that relationship. Okay? X in terms of Z, Y in terms of Z, and that's all the combinations of these. What happens if we have four goods? I'll add W in here. If there are four different goods, W in terms of X, W in terms of Y, W in terms of Z, right? X in terms of Y, X in terms of Z, Y in terms of Z. And so what we did have is three goods and three prices, and I'm abbreviating here, but what we had, as soon as we had four goods, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 prices. 6 ways of valuing these goods. And what's happening is the economy is getting more complex. And I'm not going to go, but what if we have, I'm not going to go through it, but what if we have a fifth good and a sixth and a seventh? What happens? And I can draw you a little graph, and then I'll kind of talk about this in slightly different terms here in a second. But I can draw you a graph, and here's what it shows us. Here's the number of goods in our society, and here are the number of prices. By prices, I mean, and this is all a barter economy, but prices are relative prices of goods in terms of other goods. And what we have is a relationship that's nonlinear. I'll put a 0 down here because, of course, we want to see where we're started. And what's happening is this, is that we start off, and then this curve is going up at an exponential rate. As the economy becomes more complex, we're getting more goods and services in the economy, then the number of prices is increasing very rapidly. Well, guess what? The first place that happened with a complex society was where, or a complex economy, lots of goods, was the first place there were a lot of people living with each other and doing business with each other. And guess where that was? Sumer. Right? When you have 30 people living in a tribe or a band and they're just kind of roaming across the countryside, they have a simple economy. They might be making hatchets and arrows and, you know, a couple of different kinds of clothes and so forth. And that's not very complicated. But as we get a more complicated economy, as there are people who specialize not in just making furniture, but maybe making chairs with 3 legs. And here's another person that specializes in chairs with 4 legs, and another one making small benches and larger tables and so forth. As we start getting thousands of people living near each other, they start specializing in what they produce. There's more variety in the economy, more goods, and as soon as you have to start valuing each good in terms of other goods, we've got a complicated situation. And think about this. You go to the store, and suppose that you get up to the front. You push the cart up front, and so then you say, "What do I owe you?" Well, how are we going to do this? You're going to pay me in shoestrings? Are you going to pay me in shoes? Are you going to pay me in basketballs or basketball tickets? Shirts? Bearskins? How are you going to pay me? Everything is a possibility. How many different goods are there, items, different unique items at a modern day grocery store? Anybody like an account or a marketing major in here maybe had that in a textbook or something? 10,000 would be a modest number, not huge. It's thousands and thousands. And so if we've got thousands of different things, like you walk up front and say, "Here's a bag of potatoes, what I owe you," and if they can just tell you what you owe in terms of thousands of different things, what do you have inventories of? And so it's a very complicated situation. And so what happens is we start getting overloaded with information. Gosh, I'm trying to keep track of this. This is a little bit, as I said, like visiting a foreign country. And if you've visited many foreign countries, it's not very hard to get outsmarted on a price. And you think, that's a good deal. No, it's not. You just can't keep track of this fast enough. The only thing is, when you visit a foreign country, you're used to dollars, and now they've added one more thing to the mix, the peso or whatever. Well, suppose you visited a foreign country where that there are thousands of different items, and they can just value things in terms of anything. It's very easy for you to become overwhelmed. Here's a formula for this. The number of relative prices is equal to G times G minus 1 over 2, where G is the number of goods. Okay, and so I started you off, let's go over here and just do a few simple calculations. I started you off with the simplest possible calculation. I say if there are 3 different goods, then G times G minus 1, 3 times 2, over 2, is equal to what? 3. So we did a simple situation. When there were 4 different goods, 4 times 3 over 2 equals 12 over 2 equals 6. What if there are 10 different goods? 10 times 9 over 2 is equal to 45. Yes? 90 over 2. What if there are 1,000 different goods? 1,000 times 999 over 2 equals... This won't work on the test, but I'll tell you pretty close how to get an answer. It's not exactly right, though. That's almost 1,000 times 1,000. And what's 1,000 times 1,000? 1,000,000. So this is approximately, but not exactly, but approximately 1,000,000 divided by 2, 1/2, I'll put a little dot there for approximately, 500,000 different prices. Now, the thing is, if we just had 3, 4, 5, 6, 12, 15, 18, 22 things to remember, we can do pretty well at that. Over time, you get some experience, and you can kind of process that in your head. But if somebody asks you to remember 500,000 things or to kind of just juggle these numbers around in your head, can't do it. So this becomes a transaction cost. The cost of processing information. And when the cost is prohibitively high, and that's what's happening here, then what happens is we become bad consumers. We go to the store and we don't know if we're getting a good deal or a bad deal. And I don't mean to say if you've overpaid by 2 pennies or underpaid by 2 pennies. What I mean to say is you could pay 10 times too much for something if you're just hit with more information than your brain can process. And so what happens is we had already a transaction cost, the cost of finding a trading partner, but in a barter economy we had the cost of managing the information that is required to transact in the market economy. It's a second kind of transaction cost. And that makes barter a very costly, a very inefficient way of doing business. And so people said, what can we do about this? And what people in Sumer did is they found a single item and they said, hey, let's express values in terms of this one item. And what'd they use? Grains of silver. Accountants in those days, and there may be a few accounting majors in here, but accountants in those days used silver, grains of silver for expressing values. Something's worth 10 grains of silver, something else 30 grains, something else 50 grains. And so what you could say is, hey, 10 grains, 30 grains, 50 grains. Well, this thing is worth 3 times as much as the first thing. This next thing is worth 5 times as much as the first thing. And as soon as we have some common unit of measurement, a unit of account, it simplified the economy and it made possible for people to trade and know they were getting a good deal or a bad deal, but know their situation in the marketplace. But that is what they used. They used the balanced silver accounts in Sumer, and that was the first example of a unit of account. Money performs that function. We spend in our society dollars to buy things, that's our medium of exchange, and we use dollars as our unit of account in the United States today. That's where we'll stop for the day, and we'll pick up here tomorrow.